Oh, man. I'm going to kind of not answer your question. Well, actually, no. I'll answer your question. But I'm going to put a big-ass caveat on it. I prefer Tail, number one. And I also prefer actual Descendants of Dragons. That said, if we're being real, I don't really fuck with fantasy races. Like, it's not a super productive conversation to have a lot of the time because, like, D&D just is a game with fantasy races. That's just it. It has them. Fantasy playable races, I should say. It just has them. So I don't hit on this a lot, but if I had my preference, I would kind of just delete fantasy races and just kind of have everything be humans. Because I broadly don't really see the value add of them. Now, I've heard a lot of arguments about the value add of like having different fantasy races, different fantasy speechers, gasps, and elvish. Yeah, I don't know. That is crazy. But it's also like, again, it's not a useful opinion because there's no like way that I'm not going to change anything, and I'm mostly not going to change other people's minds on it. But yeah, I mostly see, like, if we're talking about like the mechanical value add, that can be captured in so many other ways. And if we're talking about the flavor value add, I legitimately prefer interesting and disparate cultures that are just human. I think that there are more... I broadly think that we can tell the same types of stories that we can tell with these fantasy races in a much more grounded and in a much more grounded way with less risk of breaking the metaphor, because fantasy races are almost always a metaphor for real world, like analog peoples. And I honestly, most of the time, find the metaphor to be not overly helpful and sometimes actively detrimental. I know that that's a big hot take, though, which is why I've never really mentioned it. And it's also like, it's not something that I like ban from my tables. It's not something that I would recommend anyone banning from their table. But if I do someday make a TTRPG, it's probably going to be only humans. Like, it's why I prefer, like, Cyberpunk to, like, Shadowrun. I'm not a huge fantasy race person. Also likes Takyard. Look, if I disliked a system just because it had fantasy races, I wouldn't be able to play most systems at this point. That's actually the most Molten Volcano Blaster TTRPG take I've ever heard. Yeah. I don't know. You can make the same arguments to fantasy races that you can make for class fantasy. It's a way to explore something you can't be IRL. Yeah, yes. But it is, I agree. The actual difference of making them different races and different species is the part that I don't... Because it's not like we have different sapient species on Earth, you know? It's not like there are literal dragonborns outside that I can, like, that it's like, oh, I wonder what it'd be like. Like, you know? I don't know. Like, I don't see what fantasy species can do that different cultures of humans can't do in terms of exploring fantasy. I don't have like any like recommended action on. It's just an opinion that I hold. To me, fantasy feels so basic without different species. My gut reaction, and I'm not saying this is a correct opinion. I'm not saying that any of this is the correct opinion. I honestly haven't interrogated it too much. But my gut reaction is if the fantasy feels basic without different species, it wasn't interesting to begin with. If taking out the different species if that's the change that makes it feel basic, it's not interesting at base. And the core of it needs some work. I think the physical distinction makes it easier to create distinction. It makes it easier, but I would argue I'm on my old man, the easy way is not the right way type shit. I'm on my old man shit of, yeah, it's easier to draw distinctions, but I think that that is sort of a crutch that actually leads towards the end product less creative and worse. But look, tieflings are hot as fuck. Is this my wife's alt account? She fucking loves tieflings. I think we took a step towards what you're getting at with the new core rulebook by taking out race bonuses. Yeah, I much prefer backgrounds. We don't have magic either or shape-shifting. Yes, but magic is something that we, like, the analogy of magic is not an actual analogy because, like, I guess you could say that it's an analogy for affluence, but races are almost primarily analogies for real-world groups of people. And so, like, there's no way to get at what magic gets at in any other way. But if we want to get at, like, the sleeplessness of elves, that can be approached through magic, or backgrounds, or cultures. If we want to get at the stoneworking history of dwarves, that's maybe that's an incredibly cultural thing. But I will say my feelings on tieflings and warforged and, like, those sorts of races are actually much more favorable. I really like races that are created. I like races that have a literal creation myth or literally created rather than being these, like, naturally evolving differences. Because I think that the actual creation of, like, a tiefling or a warforged says a lot, or plants them more firmly within the world that I think a broad created by the gods doesn't really do. Senshi. Thank you, Senshi. Yeah, I'm on my Senshi shit. But, yeah. Species race comes with different powers, abilities that I find appealing that I can't do as a human. I agree. I just don't see any reason that those powers and abilities have to be tied to species. That's what I'm saying about, like, I don't actually see the value add of a species, is that there's no reason that those mechanical things for you to explore need to be tied to, like, a genetic disposition. You know what I'm saying? And I think that that sort of thing is broadly not helpful. Yeah. Because, like, you have these sorts of things, like differing powers and abilities in system that don't have that don't have different races. They will have, like, different cultures or different ancestries or something where it's like, oh yeah, this culture has been, like, has like techniques and stuff and learned traits to see underground, and they therefore have dark vision. That sort of thing. Or this city has a specific ritual that it teaches to all of its children and descendants that allows them to not sleep. But they have to perform their ritual every night. That sort of thing. Like, I don't see... I fully understand the different power and abilities mindset. I don't see a reason that those need to be attached to, like, the genetics and the appearance of a different race. Yeah. They are, which is why, like, this is a hot take, but it's also not something that I'm, like, really advocating hard for, because I do think that it's a lazy way to do it that comes with, I do truly think, less good than if you did it alternative ways. But those alternative ways are harder, and at the end of the day, it's not that bad. And so I don't hate it that much, you know. Yeah. A lot of book fantasy use magic as an analog for affluence. It's tough though because affluence also just exists in D&D. So it's not as direct of a parallel, but yeah. I think that you saying that different races are almost always allegories for different groups of people is just wrong. I'm actually trying to parse that. It is almost always true within real world mythologies if we look at anthropological evidence. And I'm going through in my brain like really popular fantasy. Like I'm thinking like Lord of the Rings. Elves are just 1%ers. Just like I can't really think of a popular fantasy series that where the races are not analogs to real world groups of people. Yeah, I can't really think of any. But I'm open to counterexamples. Why not? Races are additive. To me, you're taking away an aspect of the fantasy. I think that's the core of my opinion. I don't find them additive. I find them actually largely subtractive because they're a crutch for representing culture and actually putting in the work to develop a real culture rather than just using a race is going to result in a more interesting setting and world. So that's my thing. That's why I said I'm on my Senshi shit. Is like I think that it's too easy of a way out and results in an overall worse product. Now you can do both. And that's why I like Tieflings and Warforged and those sorts of things, because they have like requirements around them just broadly existing that kind of force you to develop the lore in ways that you don't have to for the other races. But yeah, they're a nice extra addition for the fantasy that allows. Yeah, and I mean, I think the way that I'll kind of end it out is the way that I'll kind of end it out is like, if you have really developed and distinct cultures, I think that's good. That's the thing at the end of the day. But I often find that races and species are used to not do that. They are used as like a shorthand shortcut for those things, which results in an overall worse world. But I do think that you can have an interesting world with fantasy races. I just don't think that the fantasy races are what actually make that world interesting. I think it seems like I saw a couple of people mention the aesthetics of different races, which I can understand. I don't really vibe with it. I don't particularly care about like the aesthetics that are related to a different species. But also I recognize that some people really do care about that sort of thing. Yeah, some people just want to have scales, which, hey, if you just want to have scales, more fucking power to you. That is totally fine. But I also saw someone being like, why isn't, or can't you just connect all of the races to like a common gene pool, which you can do, but then at that point it feels mechanically odd to have them exhibit so differently in ways that are not like then it would go back to, well, the reason that anything that they have different abilities or powers must be environmental then. And so we kind of wrap back around to that for me. But yeah, I want to be a pretty color. I agree it's not needed. However, it can be good for exploring certain themes. Yeah, and I saw a discussion about like the Dro, which I think are a good example of like bio morality characteristics that I don't love. Yeah. So I think there's if it is like purely aesthetic and you just want to have scales, I can get that. Like I don't personally feel it, but I can get that. If it is a discussion of different entities having different abilities, and wanting to explore the fantasy of biology having an impact on or having a strong impact on the baseline characteristics of you as a person, I wouldn't say that's like an invalid thing to want to explore or fantasy. but I don't find, I don't know. I'd have to think about that more because my gut reaction is that I don't love it, but I'd have to think in more detail about why. But the aesthetics, I totally get. But you think it doesn't make sense why the same gene pool, they are different. That seems direct opposite. If you don't want to get rid of the different base stats, but you think it doesn't make sense why as the same gene pool, they're so different. I don't know if we're saying the same thing here, Pharaoh. I'm fine with getting rid of the different base stats. I'm fine with getting rid of the different base stats. Like at that point, yeah, it's just an aesthetic difference, which I don't personally view as a value add, but that is like my own concept of value. That is like purely opinion based. if it's like purely aesthetic. But then, and so yes, so then the second part I do think. I think it doesn't make sense for them to be super different from the same gene pool. So yeah, the first part I'd love it. I love the direction of 524 getting rid of the ability score increases from species. I think that's a great direction to go in. I way prefer them being linked to backgrounds than species. So yeah, if it's purely aesthetic, yeah, that's fine. Most of the weird-looking races are very explicitly incredibly varied to the point where it invites you to change them aesthetically. Yeah, to a degree. Anyway,